Texas Hill Country, July 1874. The sun was ruthless that day, burning white overhead when Odessa Mayfield dropped face first into the dust. The trail was empty except for the wind and a few circling buzzards. Her bonnet had fallen a mile back, her skin red and blistering, lips cracked open like dry earth. She had not eaten in 2 days. Her water had run out after the creek she was counting on turned out to be nothing but a muddy trickle. Her legs gave in first, then her breath, then everything else. She collapsed between 2 narrow mesquites, her skirts heavy with sweat and grime. The sun kept pressing down. That was where Fletcher Ward found her. He was riding back from checking fence lines on the east edge of his spread. A quiet ranch nestled between 2 rocky ridges, and a dry creek he still hoped might run again come spring. He spotted her by the unnatural stillness, no movement, no sound, not even a hand swatting at the flies gathering around her. "God Almighty," he muttered, leaping off his horse before it had fully stopped. He knelt beside her, pressed 2 fingers to her throat, and found a weak, stuttering pulse. Her face was scorched, her lips split, her breathing shallow. "Miss," he said sharply, pulling off his glove and patting her cheek. "Miss, can you hear me?" No response. Her skin was hot as a branding iron. Fletcher grabbed his canteen and tipped a few drops into her mouth. She coughed weakly but did not wake. He poured some water onto his kerchief and wiped her face, then soaked the cloth and laid it against her neck. There was not time to wait. He lifted her carefully, arms under her knees and back, and carried her to his horse. "Easy now," he murmured as he slung her across his saddle, then mounted behind her and held her upright with one arm around her waist. She weighed nothing. It took nearly 40 minutes to ride back to the ranch, and by the time they reached the porch, Fletcher's shirt was soaked through with sweat and her head had lolled against his chest. He kicked the front door open and carried her inside. His house was plain wooden floors, stone hearth, 1 bedroom off the main room, but it was cool and dark. He laid her on the bed and went straight to the kitchen, grabbing a basin, cloth, and more water. He worked in silence. Damp cloth to her forehead. Small sips of water coaxed past her lips. Somewhere in the middle of it, she stirred, her eyes fluttered open. Pale green, confused. "You are safe," he said quickly. "You passed out on the trail." Her gaze darted around the room, then back to him. "Where?" "My ranch, about 12 miles west of Marble Falls." She tried to sit up. He laid a hand on her shoulder. "Do not push yourself, you need rest." Her voice was hoarse. "My name's Odessa Mayfield. Fletcher Ward," he said. "You are lucky I found you." She gave a dry, broken laugh. "Luck has not been much on my side lately." He pulled a chair close to the bed. "What happened?" Odessa looked past him toward the window. "My husband died in Kentucky last winter. Fever took him and the baby. I had nothing left there. So I packed what I could, took the train to Austin, and bought a wagon to try and find a plot of land to start over. The wagon broke down 2 days back. I tried walking, thought I could make it to the next town." She trailed off, her voice catching. Fletcher's jaw tightened. "You were alone," she nodded. "I have no one, not anymore." He watched her a moment, then stood. "You do now." Odessa blinked. "What?" "I said you are not alone anymore." He poured more water into a cup and handed it to her. "Drink slow." She took it with trembling hands. As she drank, Fletcher moved around the room, quietly tending the fire, setting bread to warm, pulling a quilt from the trunk. When he returned, she was watching him. "You live out here all alone?" "Yes, family." He shook his head. "Parents passed. I built this place myself." There was something steady in the way he spoke. No rush, no pity, just calm honesty. "You saved my life," she said quietly. Fletcher looked at her, eyes dark and steady. "Anyone would have." "No," she whispered, "not anyone." He did not reply, but something shifted in the air between them. Odessa felt it. Warmth, quiet and real, like the first hint of dawn after a long night. That evening, she managed to sit up and eat a little. Fletcher gave her space, but stayed close, always within reach. When she woke from a nightmare just before midnight, he was there, sitting in the chair by her bed, head tipped back against the wall. He opened his eyes the moment she gasped. "It is all right," he said gently. "You are safe." She curled onto her side, her voice shaking. "I dreamed I was back in that sun, burning." Fletcher rose and sat on the edge of the bed, not touching her, just close. "That will not happen again." She looked at him, her eyes wide and tired. "Why are you being so kind to me?" He hesitated, then reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "Because you matter, and nobody should be left in the dirt." Odessa did not answer, but her hand found his and held it. Fletcher closed his fingers around hers, gentle and sure. Outside, the wind stirred in the trees. Inside, something new had taken root, quiet and slow but strong. It was not love yet, but it would be. By the third morning, Odessa walked to the porch on her own. Her steps were slow but steady. She wore one of Fletcher's old shirts, sleeves rolled and tied at her waist, and a borrowed skirt hemmed quick with a patch of thread she'd found in his kitchen drawer. The morning air still held a trace of coolness, and she stood leaning against the post, watching the sun rise over the ridge as if she'd never seen it before. Fletcher came around the side of the house, arms full of kindling. He didn't speak right away, just set the wood in the box by the door and wiped his hands on his trousers. "Sleep all right?" he asked without looking at her. "I did." She kept her eyes on the horizon. "Had a dream I was in my childhood room, windows open. Honeysuckle climbing the sill." He nodded once, then stepped past her to the porch rail and leaned his forearms on it. "You from the mountains?" "Foothills outside Somerset. My father kept bees." She glanced at him. "You don't talk much, do you?" "Not unless there's something worth saying." Odessa smiled faintly. "I think I like that." They stood in silence for a while, watching the sky brighten. A red-tailed hawk rose in slow circles above the far ridge. Somewhere behind the barn, a cow lowed. Fletcher shifted his weight. "I've got a few chores need tending. If you feel up to it, you can come along or rest." "I'd rather be useful." She turned toward the steps. "I'm stronger than I look." He didn't argue. They walked together to the barn, Odessa pausing once to catch her balance. The interior was dark and smelled of animals and dry hay. Inside, 2 milk cows shifted in their stall and a pair of goats watched with indifferent eyes. Fletcher handed her a pail. "We'll start with feed." She followed him through the routine. He didn't hover, but he watched quietly from the corner of his eye when she scattered corn for the chickens and rubbed down the horse. She moved slowly but with purpose, sleeves rolled to the elbow, eyes steady. "I'm no stranger to chores," she said lightly as she wiped her hands on her skirt. "I can see that." They returned to the house near noon. Fletcher laid a wedge of cheese and a heel of bread on the table. She sat across from him. "You built all this alone." He broke the bread in two and handed her half. "Took me 3 years. Had a dog for part of it." "What happened to him?" "Snakebite." Odessa nodded once and didn't pry further. She ate slowly, chewing each bite with care. Afterward, she stood and gathered the dishes. "Is there soap under the sink?" She washed without being asked, sleeves wet to the elbow, hands red from scrubbing. Fletcher dried and put away, neither of them speaking, but the silence had changed. It wasn't the hush of strangers anymore. It felt lived in, like a space made wide enough for both. That evening, after supper, they sat outside again. The wind had picked up, rustling the dry leaves in the live oaks near the house. Odessa pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I used to think I'd live and die within 5 miles of where I was born," she said softly. "What changed?" "Everything that could." He didn't respond right away. "Then you regret coming west?" She shook her head. "No. It hurt, but it taught me what I can survive." Fletcher shifted in his chair. "You plan to keep going? After you're strong?" She turned to look at him, eyes unreadable in the fading light. "I don't know yet." He let that settle. A cricket chirped from somewhere near the porch steps. "I've got a spare acre down by the creek," he said finally. "Soil's not bad, could grow beans, maybe squash." Odessa looked out toward the trees. "You offering it to me? I'm saying it's there if you want it." She nodded slowly, then stood. "I'll think on it." He watched her walk back into the house, her steps sure now, not fast but sure. When the door closed behind her, he stayed sitting, listening to the wind and the sound of her moving inside. There was no rush. Time would carry them where it would, but for now she was here. And that was enough. The evening sun spilled long shadows across the back pasture when Odessa found Fletcher at the edge of the corral, tightening the rail that had come loose in last week's thunderstorm. His shirt clung damp across his back, and the brim of his hat was pulled low to keep the sweat from his eyes. I boiled down the last of those apples you had in the bin, she said, stepping beside him with her hands tucked into the apron she'd sewn from the remnants of a feed sack. Poured it into jars, you'll have something sweet for the months ahead. He glanced at her, then back to the rail. Didn't know you canned. Didn't know you kept apples past July. I built that root cellar for winters. Well, she said, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek, you'll have preserves now, too. They stood quiet a moment, the wood creaking under Fletcher's hands as he drove the final nail. Odessa leaned against the post beside him, watching the horses graze in the golden light. Have you always lived this far out? She asked. Since I was 20. Took work breaking horses just south of Lanneau before that, saved every penny I could. Odessa ran her fingers along the grain of the wood. I never met a man who built his whole life with his own hands. Didn't have much choice, he said, glancing at her. No one else was going to do it for me, she smiled, something quiet and full in her face. Maybe that's why it feels so steady out here. Like the place knows who it belongs to. Fletcher looked at her then, and for the first time didn't look away. I've been thinking, he said slowly, about that acre I mentioned. Odessa turned toward him, brow lifted. I could run a fence around it, clear the brush. You'd have space for a garden come spring, maybe keep hens if you're up to it. And what would I be doing in the meantime? His gaze didn't waver. Whatever you wanted, stay on as long as you like, longer if you wanted that too. She didn't answer right away. Her eyes searched his, then glanced past him toward the hills. A breath passed between them. I didn't come west looking for someone, she said finally. Didn't think I'd know how to trust again. I'm not asking for anything more than what you've got in you to give. Odessa stepped closer, the hem of her skirt brushing the toe of his boot. Then maybe I'll stay, not because I need a piece of land, but because you've given me something steadier than ground. Fletcher's voice was low but firm. You'll never owe me a thing, I know that, she said. That's why I'm saying yes. The sun had dropped behind the ridge by the time they walked back to the house, her hand resting in the crook of his arm. Neither spoke, but the silence between them had changed again. It was no longer a pause, it was a promise. Inside, she lit the lamp while he stoked the fire. The wind tugged at the shutters once, then fell still. I'll make coffee, she said. I'll fetch more wood. They moved through the room like they'd done it 100 times. And when Fletcher returned, Odessa was waiting by the table, 2 mugs in hand, her eyes lit soft by the flame. Fletcher set the kindling aside and took the mug. Their fingers brushed, and this time neither of them pulled away. Odessa sat across from him, and for a long while they simply drank in silence. You ever thought about what kind of life you'd want if the world let you choose? She asked. I'd want something quiet, with someone who knows how to be still without feeling empty. He looked at her. Someone who could look me in the eye and not flinch. Odessa met his gaze. I think I'd want someone who sees past what I've lost, who doesn't try to fix me, just makes room for what's still here. You've got more than most, he said. So do you. They didn't touch again that night. They didn't have to. The next morning, Fletcher found her out by the well, drawing water with her sleeves rolled and her braid falling loose down her back. She turned when she heard his boots. Thought I'd wash our linens today, she said. Weather's good for drying. I'll bring the wash tub. She smiled, warm and sure. You bring the tub, I'll bring the rest. And so they began, not because they needed to, but because they wanted to. Odessa rubbed her palms dry on the apron stretched across her lap and watched the smoke rise from the branding fire. A soft wind stirred the grass around her boots, and from where she sat beneath the cottonwood, she could see Fletcher working a young steer into the chute, silent, focused, deliberate in every motion. He'd asked her that morning if she wanted to stay near the house. She had simply tied up her hair and said, I'll bring the water and rag, you see to the rest. Now, hours later, the kettle hissed beside her on the stones, and the sun had already begun its slow descent behind the ridge. Odessa lifted the dipped rag from the basin and wrung it out with practiced hands. Fletcher led the calf out, the smoke still curling from its side. He looked over and she stood, meeting him halfway with the cloth. You're favoring your right side, she said, pressing the damp rag into his palm. Pulled something in my hip 2 days ago, he admitted, turning so she could dab the sweat at his neck. You should have said. Didn't feel like complaining. She raised an eyebrow. There's a difference between complaining and letting someone help. He leaned against the fence post, his chest rising slow with each breath. You've taken to this place quicker than I expected. Odessa tucked the rag into her apron. I've lived through worse. And it's different when something's being built right, not just endured. He glanced toward the distant hills. I've got enough timber stacked to start framing a second shed. Could use another pair of hands if I'm to finish before the rains. I can drive nails as well as any farmhand, she said, brushing dust from her skirt. His mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. I believe you. They walked up to the house together, the sound of their boots in the grass the only noise between them. As they reached the porch, Odessa paused at the edge and looked out across the slope. There's a place just past that bend, she said. I was thinking of planting corn there when the time comes. The soil tilts right for drainage. Fletcher followed her gaze. You thinking of staying on for the next season? She didn't answer right away. Her fingers rested lightly on the porch rail. I've been turning it over in my mind. It's not just the land, it's the way the air feels in the morning. The silence doesn't feel empty anymore. He stepped up beside her. You wouldn't be here alone, that matters. I know it does, she said, her voice low. I never thought I'd say this again, but I want to build something lasting. Not just a roof overhead, something that holds. Fletcher's hand brushed hers, not by accident. Then we'll build it together. Her fingers closed around his. Inside, the kitchen still held the scent of the stew she'd made before they rode out. Fletcher ladled it into bowls while Odessa set the tin plates and poured water from the crock. The fire crackled low behind them, casting long shadows up the wall. You ever think about what you'd do if you weren't here? She asked between bites. He looked up from his bowl. Not really. I never had a reason to leave. And now, he met her eyes across the table, now I've got every reason to stay. Odessa held his gaze, her spoon resting against the rim of her bowl. I never expected to feel safe again, not like this, not with someone. You are, he said, safe. And wanted. She reached across the table and set her hand over his. That's the part that's new. They didn't speak again for a long while. Later, after the dishes were cleaned and the lanterns dimmed, they stepped out into the yard. The moon was half full, casting silver light across the pasture. Odessa stood close to him, her breath visible in the cooling air. I think I'll start that corn patch tomorrow, she said. I'll help you turn the ground. No, she said, voice soft but steady. I want to do the first row myself. Fletcher nodded. All right. She turned her face up toward him, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she rose onto her toes and pressed her lips to his gentle, brief sure. He didn't speak. Neither did she. But after, Fletcher took her hand and led her back inside, and the door closed softly behind them. By late September, the corn rose waist-high behind the house, thick with green and tasseling early. A string of sun-warmed days had stretched across the valley, and Odessa moved through them with sleeves rolled and her hair pinned in a simple twist, ankles dusted from the path she walked each morning to check the plants. Fletcher was mending a harness strap at the workbench near the barn when she came to him, holding a folded scrap of paper in her hand, edges creased and worn smooth. I need to ask you something, she said, her voice quiet but certain. He looked up from the leather, wiping his hands on his trousers. Go on, she held out the paper. This was tucked into the lining of my satchel. I must have forgotten it. It's a land receipt, east of here, closer to Lampasas. I bought it before I left Austin. Fletcher took the paper, eyes scanning the faded ink. You never said. I didn't know if I'd live long enough to use it, she said, but I've been thinking I don't want it now, not the way I thought I did. He folded it and handed it back. You sure? I am. She slipped it into her apron. Starting fresh doesn't mean doing it alone, not anymore. He took a step closer. Then what do you want instead? Odessa met his gaze without hesitation. I want to keep planting here. I want to raise things that take time. I want your name beside mine when I sign anything from now on. Fletcher didn't speak for a long moment. Then he reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small, worn pouch. He opened it, and inside was a ring plain silver, its band smooth but strong. My mother wore this, he said. I've kept it since I was 17, wasn't sure what I was saving it for until now. Odessa stared at the ring, then at him. You don't have to, I know, he said, but I want to. She held out her hand and he slid the ring onto her finger. It fit without a hitch. That evening, they sat beneath the stars with their chairs pulled close. Fletcher played a few quiet notes on the fiddle he rarely touched, and Odessa shelled beans into a wooden bowl at her feet. You ever think you'd end up with someone like me? She asked, eyes trained on the sky. No, he said, but I never thought I'd want anything more than a fence line that held. You changed that. I didn't mean to. I know, he said. That's why it stuck. She set the bowl aside and leaned her head against his shoulder. The fiddle rested in his lap, strings silent now. Fletcher, she asked, I want to be married before frost. He nodded against her hair. We'll ask the circuit preacher to stop by next pass, should be 3 weeks or so, and after, we'll keep doing what we're doing, only better. She smiled, eyes closed. That sounds like peace. It was. They married in early October beneath the cottonwood, with only the preacher, the sky, and the land to witness. Fletcher wore his cleanest shirt. Odessa had cut and stitched a dress from an old calico bolt she found in the back of the pantry. She wore her hair loose, and he couldn't stop looking at her. There was no feast, only stew and cornbread, and peaches she had preserved in August. Afterward, they walked the ridge trail behind the house, hand in hand, the wind cool and sharp with the coming season. I never thought I'd feel rooted again, she said as they paused to watch the sun drop behind the ridge. You are now, he said. Right here, she turned to him. And you, he kissed her with both hands on her face. I've been home since the day I found you under those mesquites. Years passed in that house. They turned the second shed into a smokehouse. Odessa's corn grew tall each summer, and in winter she dried herbs above the hearth. Fletcher taught her to ride properly, and she taught him to read poetry from the books she kept tucked in the bottom of her trunk. They built a life slow and solid, each day laid down with quiet love and work. They argued sometimes over seed orders, over fence repairs, over whether the cows should be let out early in spring. But it never lasted. They learned each other's silences and gave them room. They laughed more than they didn't. They leaned on each other without pride or pretense. One spring, a letter came from her cousin in Somerset, asking if Odessa still lived. She wrote back with a new name and a pressed flower from her garden. The cousin never replied, and she didn't mind. What she had was here. Fletcher carried her over the threshold again 5 years later when she twisted her ankle stepping down from the porch. They were older then, the lines on their faces deeper from sun and wind and seasons past. But when he set her down, she still laughed like she had the first time he'd handed her a cup of water with trembling hands. I'll never stop choosing you, she told him that night. You never have to, he said, and she never did.